Miss Green. Mr. Montoya. Schmelling. Whitlock. We have everybody. I think we're only waiting on a person or two. Give folks maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. I'm missing. All right. Well, we'll allow everyone else to trickle in. I think we only have a few, 1 or 2 or 3, 4 more people. Can you all hear me? Is my volume fine? Cool, cool. So Flamion. Huh? All right. So welcome back to another Wednesday session of Critical Race Theory. Today's topics. Ooh, hold on. Did I mess it up? Let me go backwards. Yeah, so today's topic, this is our 8th session. We're dealing with the intersections of class and race, which is a holdover from our readings from last week. And then this week's readings deal with the intersections of race and sexuality, the intersection of race and religion, and I don't have it left off there, the intersection of race and disability. I don't think that's going to be a huge mistake because as we're kind of like one little section behind, we may not be able to get to the intersection of race and disability today, and we'll definitely touch upon it next week if we're not able to get there. So we'll see what happens. Let's see. All right. I think we only have 1 or 2 more people coming through. All right. So last week, again, we'll start, of course, with review, questions, comments, concerns. Okay, this also, there we go. Okay. Yes, and again, please, yeah. So please, got your message. Please feel free to use the chat room. I think I'm getting a little better at being able to manage a bunch of different things. Although last week, I forgot to hit record. I know Zoom is supposed to have a function that automatically records, but for whatever reason, it's not working on mine, and I forgot to do it manually. So I made sure I did it this week. But if in future weeks, if you happen to notice that it's not recording, I don't even know if you guys can see it or not. But if you happen to notice that, let me know because the class should be recorded each week. It's better for you guys, and I don't have to do another review session on like Thursday and Friday or something like that. So let me know. Any current events? I didn't really see anything this week that really seemed to teach much about critical race theory. Anybody see any happenings this week of interest to anyone want to bring up to the class now? All right, well, let's get into the doctrine. All right, so we're going to review. So just reviewing again, if anybody's questions, comments, concerns, if you want to go, I have no problem going backwards for a second before we go forwards. It's funny. I was talking. I was in conversation with an educator, someone that deals with the philosophy of education and performance and stuff like that. And they said one of the reasons why many very smart students hit a brick wall later in their academic careers is because oftentimes when you get a 95 or 90 in math in 3rd grade or an 87 in history in fifth grade, and all along you're getting B's and A's, which is wonderful. But you did in fact get 10% wrong. You did in fact get 12 or 13% wrong. And to not go over it after the test is over to help you correct those smaller mistakes, the argument is that they build up over time, and then very good students hit a brick wall because of all these millions of tiny, 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 tiny gaps that go along the way. So that's part of my whole reason for always being willing to go backwards before we go forwards, right? So political and jurisprudential ideologies, critiques of critical race theory, and of course, as you know, I got a critique for everything, so we'll keep going. So there'll be no lack of that. Lat crit, big tent CRT, which again we're going to talk about today with sexuality, with religion, disability. Again, we can even kind of meld that. Big tent CRT and intersectionality can be looked at as two different genres, or they can be looked at as kind of the same or the opposite sides of the same coin. Intersectionalities began with, again, the discussion of Black women, but if we're talking about intersections of numerous sites of subordination, then it becomes a huge, not just a big tent, but wide as all outdoors, as we're going to talk about in a second, which some people think is a benefit and other things is a discredit. We talked about the legal constructions of race and the social constructions of race, right? Discussion on that, and we're going to talk about that a little more, especially when we talk about race and religion, because race and religion are very, very much intertwined and have been for, again, I view race as an ancient concept and not one that was created in the United States. Derek Bell's rules of racial standing and white privilege were our discussions last week. All right, as a matter of fact, let's just hit into a couple, just kind of quickly review discussion there. When we talked about his rules of racial standing, we can break them down more or less into kind of a reduced standing of Black professionals, right? And especially when referring to other Black professionals, that your praise and your commendations are worth less, but your condemnations are worth a lot, especially with respect to other Black people. And rule number 2, the standing of Black victims of racism have less standing than white counterparts who aren't victims or maybe are victims. Standing of decision makers, the idea that Black decision makers have no standing in race to be objective, to make objective determinations, whereas white judges are not asked to recuse themselves over similar matters. Gender happens with women judges and arbitrators all the time too. For some reason, women can't be objective when it comes to domestic violence or something like that, or a court case relating to gender violence, but a male judge for some reason is thought to be able to do so. On the other hand, those are issues of reduced standing, but you can get, on the other hand, enhanced standing against problematic Black folks. So if you are there, if you're actually going to support white supremacy, if you're going to support the elite or racial constructions, then your standing will be enhanced, which causes an issue if your criticism happens to be correct or reasonable, right? So we'll talk about that, this conundrum or this inner tension that might even be described in terms of white privilege or Black taxes, where there's an intense debate on between free expression, objectivity, and inquiry versus social cohesion, social capital, and standing with the group. Rule 5 was an expression of basically Derek Bell's racial realism or Afro-pessimism, when he says, just because you know rules 1 through 4 does not necessarily mean you can do anything about it. You can make better predictions about the future. You can kind of evaluate people, but those 4 things are going to continue to happen. Now, I think it is very reasonable to object to Derek Bell's position with respect to degree, right? Because to believe that it is static and permanent as it stands now is inconsistent with the fact that race itself has morphed and changed and grown or reduced and reverberated throughout time. So Afro pessimism or racial realism ought not be interpreted, in my view, as capitulation, right? As a reason for just giving up. Again, if you liken it to crime, greed, all of these human quote unquote sins, if we're going to use religious terminology, they're not going anywhere either. It's hard to believe that we're going to create a sinless society, and yet we do approach law and try to reduce it. Crime is probably permanent. However, you don't stop fighting it and trying to prevent it. Okay, we talked about social standing, academic standing, legal standing. And I would say that, again, Derek Bell and Kiara Bridges, and I don't want to say Kiara Bridges, but her conception of critical race theory, which I do think is accurate. I think she does paint a very solid picture of the tendencies of critical race theorists. However, we can contrast critical race theories reliance on narrative, or at least defense of narrative, and whether or not that is inconsistent with Derek Bell saying we don't have standing, right? That if you don't have standing, if your views about race are discounted severely, and then on top of that, you're not even going to fit the form, then maybe it is a cathartic, but perhaps unstrategic. And that goes to, again, Professor Obasogi's paper on how critical race theory perhaps should embrace empiricism, right? And how this is currently relevant is because there are pushes for and proposals for racial impact statements, just like victim impact statements, particularly with respect to administrative law, right? So for those that have not had administrative law, every federal statute, state statute, municipal statute has to be implemented by the executive branch. But of course, the mayor, governor, president is not going to do it themselves. They're going to have a bureaucracy, an agency do it for them. That agency or bureaucracy is going to have to fill in the gaps with tiny little mini laws or mini rules called regulations. And many people don't know, especially popularly, most people don't know that those regulations can be set aside during a public hearing, if those lobbying against it can show that they are so-called arbitrary or capricious, right? And so showing that they're arbitrary or capricious, are we, again, relying on narrative, testimony of witnesses that have been harmed? Is that more impactful and convincing than statistical analysis and studies that show impact or disparate racial impact from a objective and so-called neutral standard? Now, again, probably the obvious answer is both, right? If you got it, but we don't always have unlimited resources. So that was our, kind of a discussion of the rules of racial standing. Bridges, we also talked about white privilege, which, in my view, I think it's correct to say that the rules of racial standing are just one aspect of white privilege, as just one aspect of white supremacy. And I think that's a very good way of describing how broad and dynamic racism is, right? The rules of racial standing being one aspect of white privilege as one aspect of white supremacy. We talked very briefly about whether, again, the flip side of that, are there black privileges? Again, my little story about the passenger seat or the second seat on public transportation. Or sometimes are we confusing white privilege with wealth privilege? And I think that's going to be really very relevant very shortly, because we're going to talk about the intersections of race and class, right? That's going to be our hot topic for today. And so this question of white privilege versus wealth privilege is relevant. And some could argue that some forms of what is called white privilege aren't necessarily so, that they are forms of wealth privilege. Uh, the question of whether recognizing white privilege or the overemphasis on white privilege leads to stereotypes, which then leads to essentialism, which then leads to racial caste, right? If race is socially constructed, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, if it's a social construction, if our discourse, if our speeches, our memes, our entertainment, if all the things that we speak and do construct race, then can we exempt so-called scholarly attacks on white privilege when that discourse seems to reify and reinforce what is later in this class going to be described as differentialists, right? That these folks are different from these folks, and there will be racism or at least subordination or discrimination between the two. Group homophily, as it's called in scholarly circles. We talk about white privilege. Again, the converse of that could be called black taxes, and the idea that in terms of lesser freedom, right? We're going to talk about black taxes as far as the stripping black folks of property informally as informal taxation. That's my thing. But socially, when it comes to not just property, but your reduction of liberty, right? The conundrum of the true black conservative. And again, when I think of true black conservative, I think of the Philadelphia is deeply a democratic stronghold, deeply, and particularly within the black communities, over 95%, et cetera. However, it is very clear that black churches and their leaderships are often what I call true conservatives, right? So when you talk about social morals, moral foundations, um, um, saving, thrift, and whatnot. Those, excuse me, where conservatism generally has been conflated with racism, there is I guess a true conservatism, but black conservatives face the um, uh, specter of being called sellouts and all that for expressing that conservative nature at the polls, right? Because of the racialized nature of our elections in political parties. Um, White privilege, we can also talk about as white privilege as normativity, and that normativity we can break it down as far as population normativity, just the idea that whoever is in the majority, their cultural practices are going to dominate, right? Sort of a benign racism. Yes, it is racism, but it's only because of the population numbers. So in that sense, it's somewhat natural, right? And nobody's at fault. Versus, let's say, wealth normativity, which again argues that it's whiteness or European culture, however you want to describe it, becomes entrenched as normal because of the distribution of wealth in this country. That so long as white people hold the most wealth, that even if they don't have the majority population anymore, the idea that they hold the most wealth will again petrify those cultural practices as normal. And that again is on the one hand benign. Individuals don't take any blame for the existence of that type of racism, although we can point to individuals in the past who have helped exacerbate the racial wealth gap to what it is, right? And that's kind of where our country kind of stands now, right? Even if we recognize that racism exists today, it's a remnant from past actors, and it can't be rectified by penalizing the innocent people today, right? That is more or less the defense against affirmative action, against reparations. But then there's also psychological normativity, right? The Confederate statues and other means of symbolizing whiteness as preeminent. And that leans a little more towards acting white supremacist or acting racist. I think we can, for the South Africa as a country is a very good example or hypothetical, not hypothetical because it's real, um, a very good instance to look at that idea of population wealth and psychological normativity with respect to a very small minority controlling a very large majority, right? White privilege as social capital, right? It's very interesting because it makes it white privilege as social capital um, supports the push to more inclusion, right? It defends affirmative action, it defends integration by saying that white folks together, whether it be human, social, political, or financial capital, reverberates around each other, right? And that in access to these sites of power, right? And this is not just race, but also gender, right? That to be included within the old boys club, um, to be able to tap into very lucrative, powerful networks, right? That's what we mean by social capital. And so, even if affirmative action and doesn't or integration seem to have closed the racial wealth gap, perhaps it is a starting point where there's an increase in both human and social capital that may lead to a reduction of the wealth gap at some point. There are many scholars who disagree with that entirely. Um, then I don't think we even touched upon, I don't think we had time. I think time ran out when before we got to discuss really quickly white privilege as property. It's very simple to white privilege as social capital, but more specifically, Cheryl Harris is a colleague of Kimberly Crenshaw. You'll also see Russell Robinson's name in the text on race and sexuality. They all teach at UCLA. UCLA has a super powerful race in the law, critical race theory contingent or within their law school. Um, and so Cheryl Harris published Whiteness as Property in the Harvard Law Review, I want to say in 1992. And it was a bombshell of a paper, as you can probably can tell just from the title. And so again, tying all these things to law is the trick as far as scholarship. And so she even asked, what is in fact property, right? What is property? Do you remember when you took property law? Did you notice that in property law, every rule you learned was how it's not yours if you bought it, right? Every law in property law actually was telling you when the law was not going to return your property to you if somebody else took it, right? I bought it, it's mine. Well, in property law, you learn the rule of perpetuity says no, it's not all the time. You learn through easements, you learn through bailments, all that. That at sometimes, even if you can prove that you paid for it, uh, um, adverse possession, right? Uh, Even though you paid for it, no, not giving it back to you. We as the state will not agree to use the violence of this legal institution to return your property to you. So property is not actually a thing. Property is an expectation, right? A baby or a child, for the most part, is not property. It's a thing, but it is not necessarily property, right? Not everything is necessarily property. Property is an expectation that the state is going to recover it for you if someone else takes it from you, right? And so if property is an expectation that will, oh God, let me, sorry. If is a property that expectation that the law will protect your expectations, uh, and if the law then protects white people's expectations, then is it not fair to call that property? And there's a discussion about strict scrutiny, right? Strict scrutiny and equal protection clause says that because it begins with the idea that because Black people have been discriminated against by law, um, any racial categorization should be strictly scrutinized, and it should be absolutely necessary in order to stand, fulfill a compelling government interest. But it, instead of protecting or combating the subordination of Black people, strict scrutiny has been used to combat remedies to subordination. So in that instance, strict scrutiny is protecting the expectations of white folks not to be to keep their property unless individually condemned of racism or a tort or a crime, right? To again protect that expectation. And where does that expectation come from? Well, again, I'm not one that all believes that academia leads society, but I think the most cogent and consistent and praised, accepted philosophy of white liberalism, and I say white liberalism very broadly, so broad that it can kind of touch progressivism on the left and also conservatism on the right, is the philosopher John Rawls, who produced a concept of justice as fairness. So if you ever heard the term that within race relations, we should protect the equal opportunity versus equal outcomes, and that those who seek equal outcomes are wrong and those who seek equal opportunity are right. Much of that defense of that position emanates from John Rawls, and it is used to scuttle affirmative action and reparations and what have you, right? Affirmative action can be pushed either way on that, but it is often, his work is often used to argue that the responsibility of government is strictly to provide equality of opportunity without any concern for the actual outcomes, right? Now, to believe that the outcomes have nothing to do with the opportunities requires a belief in someone's inferiority, whether that inferiority is natural, cultural, innate, chosen, whatever the case may be. I don't see how it can be avoided. And then, of course, we touched upon this, but white privilege as race fraud, right? The argument that Krug, Dolezal, Rachel Dolezal, that they have the privilege, some argue, to pass as a Black or Latino, that is an expression of privilege. Now, on the other hand, you could make the argument that when we talk about Cheryl Harris and whiteness as property, her focus on whiteness as property was on Black women and Black men passing as white. That those who have been Black folks that have been, many of you may not have heard of the one drop rule, that for hundreds of years, the argument was if you had 1/8 or 1/16 of Black blood, if one of your 16 grandparents were Black, then you are Black, which means very light-skinned Black people were considered Black, or in Louisiana as octoroons and names of that nature. And so and this related to the question of who could be enslaved and who couldn't, right? And so this idea of passing into white society if you were light enough was a thing, right? All the way up into the mid 20th century, has lost its currency now, but it actually was a thing for quite a while, because to be considered white afforded a Black person who looked white, whatever that means, it afforded them a much grander lifestyle. It afforded them much grander opportunities, so long as they were not discovered, right? But if it was discovered, then of course, as we have with Dolezal and all that, Dolezal, under what laws can we punish, or will society punish those who are quote unquote lying about the race? First of all, how do you prove it's a lie if race does not have a biological or natural, immovable, immutable definition and description? So how do you, if there's no truth to it, how do you approve a lie to it? That's the first conundrum. Um, then also, again, in which ways does it matter? Does it matter in fraud? Does it matter in family court? Right? Deception and other types of deceptions. All right. So that leads us, so that uh, discussion about white privilege leads us to this discussion of intersection of race and class. So this was, again, the last part of the readings for last week. Before I move on, again, any questions, concerns, comments about white privilege, about the rules of racial standing? Okay, all right. So my mouth is so dry after these classes are over, talking constantly for 2 hours. I'm telling you, I definitely welcome your comments if you got some. All right. So is white privilege confused with wealth privilege? So some people argue that LeBron James, why are you so involved in racial matters? You're rich. You're super rich. Jay-Z, you're super rich. Why are you involved in racial matters? It doesn't affect you, is often a criticism of so-called of black people that are oftentimes wealthy. That that so long as you have wealth, that race does not matter. Um, However, against that, we see all types of discriminations or degradations, microaggressions, hate crimes, discriminations against black people. Oh, you know what? I guess that was to this week's current event. So Cornel West. So many of you probably are familiar with the scholar slash philosopher, the Reverend Dr. Cornel West, who was at Harvard at one point. Then he went to Princeton. Then he went back to Harvard. And apparently Harvard is denying him tenure, and he believes that race has something to do with it. Um, and so let's also stick with Harvard with Henry Louis Gates, who was the chairman of their African American Studies department, who also um, he did not make Derek Bell's list in that rules of racial standing. Like Derek Bell called out a bunch of black scholars for capitulating to, I guess, white power or whatnot in criticizing other black scholars. He named Shelby Steele, Glenn Lowry, Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, but he didn't say anything about Cornel West or Henry Louis Gates. Ooh, oh, Meghan Markle. Oh, we're gonna talk about that. Great. I'm glad somebody pointed out Meghan Markle in the royal family, right? This idea that wealth will not protect you from racism, right? Oh, fantastic, fantastic example. Wonderful. And so Henry Louis Gates got his wake up call. Uh, any, a lot of you are familiar with Dave Chappelle. One of Dave Chappelle's mentors and writers is a comedian named Paul Mooney. And if you think Dave Chappelle talks about race a lot, I don't think Paul Mooney talks about anything else. And he goes back to way the 70s. He used to write jokes for Richard Pryor, goes back way 30, 40 years. And he calls it the Negro wake up call, right? That often black people with wealth also minimize race because they want to be seen as successful individuals. They don't want their success to be attributed to affirmative action. They want to be seen as, some people even say they want to be seen as special, as above their racial colleagues and black colleagues and counterparts, that they are the good black, they are the good Negro, right? That there's value in that, right? If we want to talk about whiteness or acceptance by white as property. And so Paul Mooney said that when Henry Louis Gates uh, got arrested outside of his house and racially profiled outside of his house at Harvard, that he got his Negro wake up call. And it's very interesting because um, Professor Gates's work since then has been, I would argue, a little more, what's the word I want to use? Strident? I still wouldn't call him rebellious or a nationalist, but his views on black Pan-Africanism and the connection between African Americans and Africans has kind of strengthened, where he seemed to believe that they were that the two were distinct ethnicities, if not distinct races. Um, I'm not black. I'm Kanye. I have not seen that, and I'm a Ta-Nehisi Coates fan. I'll have to look for that. I'm not black. I'm Kanye. For those that don't know, Ta-Nehisi Coates is the son of Robert Coates, who is one of only three creators of black publishing companies in the United States of America. So there is Third World Press since the 1950s in Chicago by Hakeem Madbouti. There is African New World Press in Philadelphia, and and then the king of them all, some say, is Black Classic Press, which was started in Baltimore by Paul Coates, who begot a son named Ta-Nehisi Coates. So one of the reasons why Ta-Nehisi Coates does not have a college degree, but yet seems to be more well-read than almost the rest of us, 99.9% of the population, is because his father owns his own publishing company, and his access to books has been um, um, ubiquitous, I guess is the word. Um, so I'm definitely look for that. I definitely have some of his books in the house here somewhere. Sky, if you want to talk, and if let's talk about the wake up call real quick. The term woke, right, is very interesting. Like the term woke. So my particular perspective is the first time I ever heard the word woke was not even woke, but wake up. And the first time I recall it being used as a political slogan was in the last scene of Spike Lee's School Days. Great movie. Giancarlo Esposito, and who was the star of Breaking Bad, or one of the stars of Breaking Bad. He was in that movie. Lawrence Fishburne, uh, Jasmine Guy. And at the end of the movie, and this is a movie about historically black colleges and universities, and it's a very subtle jab at the I guess you could call neoliberal or the party nature of those schools. And the end scene is basically Lawrence Fishburne telling everyone in the school to wake up. And from that point forward, it seemed that the term woke became popular. A lot of interesting. It's real. I love how words like get created and whatnot. Any basketball fans in the room? You ever notice that all the Jalen's in today's world, and that there were not Jalen's before the basketball player Jalen Rose from the Michigan Wolverines? It's really interesting. Words, where they come from, is really interesting to me. Anyway, so when we talk about this white privilege versus wealth privilege, you guys have given fantastic examples. Absolutely. The royal family, Meghan Markle. Wow, that I can't believe I excluded that one. Thank you. Uh, and that's very similar to an issue that happened maybe a couple weeks ago about an affluent black couple that had a home appraisal, right, for selling their home, and they believed it was low, and basically had a white couple. They hired a new appraiser, hired a white couple to stand in there and pretend that they owned the home, and the appraisal came in hundreds of $1,000s higher than when they were thought to be the owners. So this idea of race privilege or white supremacy, racial microaggressions, however you want to describe it, it has value. It costs, whether you want to call it a tax on one side or privileges on the other. They work to exacerbate the racial wealth gap, which perpetuates race privilege on its own. So let's talk about a little more about that intersection of race and class between, let's say, the black poor and the white poor, right? Because if we look at the numbers, the majority of black people are poor and the majority of white people are poor, right? And so if we're going to talk about wealth privilege, then maybe we should talk about the intersection or the interest convergence, right? We can talk about intersection, or we can talk about the interest convergence of, let's say, poor black people and poor white people, right? Which constitutes a super majority of the country. So you would think in a democracy whenever poor white people and poor black people have the same interests and constitute the majority of the country, you would assume that they get what they want. And yet that is pretty much not necessarily, or some people will say hardly ever the case, and use it as proof that we are not necessarily in a democracy, but an oligarchy or a plutocracy, or maybe even so-called feudalism, right? Um, so one of the most important cases that's not talked about in popular discourse, especially with respect to class, and not just class, but class and race. It's the perfect case to me that talks that shows this confluence and convergence between race and class is U.S. versus Richardson, 1971. Has anybody heard of this case before? Okay, that is hugely unfortunate. U.S. versus Richardson is the case that determines that class is not either a does not either get strict or intermediate scrutiny, right? So group subordination under the equal protection class, gender gets intermediate scrutiny, race gets strict scrutiny, right? So if you use race, if you discriminate based on race, you have to have a compelling government interest. It must be narrowly tailored. If you're going to discriminate on the basis of gender, it has to be an important government interest, and the rule must substantially further the mission on that towards that interest. But when it comes to regular old legislation that may help wealthy people more than poor people, rational basis review, which we know passes Supreme Court muster almost without question, right? Any rational basis whatsoever. And so the opportunity arises that because black people are disproportionately poor, that we can promote racism in a colorblind manner by using class as pretext, right? So U.S. versus Richardson. What is the issue there? The issue in U.S. versus Richardson follows Brown versus Board of Education. It is probably the hallmark of the failure of the desegregation, if you believe desegregation was in fact a failure. Brown versus Board of Education is passed in 1955. It requires, it holds that racially segregated schools are against equal protection clause. After that, you had to have several decisions. Brown 2 says that it's not that those schools will not be sanctioned immediately, right? If they're against the equal protection clause in 1955, then they need to change by 1956, right? No. Brown 2 said that you only need to dismantle the segregation with all deliberate speed, whatever that meant. So they were given time to dismantle and then figure out ways to dismantle. One of the ways of so-called dismantling were many southern cities gave up their whole public school system. There's no requirement in the Constitution to provide public schools in the first place. So what they did was took all their public schools and then sold them, sometimes for $1, to the church. Because the church is a private entity that does not have to respond to equal protection, right? So mascots, school colors, and all that were sometimes donated or transferred to private hands so that segregation could continue. Anyway, it still marched on. And then in 1971, a case came that said, well, what about property taxes? Is it not against the Equal Protection Clause to base school funding on the property taxes that are paid in that district, and therefore create these multi-tiered educational systems where rich counties in the state get great education, poor counties in the state get poor education? If education is a legal matter, if it's created and provided by the state, why is it not provided equally? And why is it provided unequally and inequitably based on this scheme of property taxes. In other words, why shouldn't the property taxes all go to the state or what have you, or come out the state budget, and then the budget distribute educational opportunities equally? The same amount of funding in the rich neighborhoods as the poor neighborhoods, the same amount of funding in the rural neighborhoods as the urban neighborhoods. That if there's if there's a state budget for education, that perhaps it should be distributed on a per child basis, right? Pro rata. Supreme Court said no. The Supreme Court said no. So U.S. versus Richardson not only rejects that attack on property tax funding, it refuses to apply strict scrutiny to those decisions, right? So education can be distributed from county to county, city to city, even within that city, district to district, without concern for discriminating on the basis of class. Part of the problem with class as a protected category is its definition. That if race has a fluid or ambiguous definition, class maybe, you could argue, has an even greater ambiguity or indeterminacy, right? What constitutes class, especially when money, right? We're in a system that where inflation is practically inherent. So $1,000 in wealth 50 years ago might not be. $100,000 in wealth might not be poor today, but it might be poor in 100 years from now, right? So to put in statute or put in a Supreme Court opinion that this is the definition of poor, this monetary standard, or what, perhaps a standard of living. Again, and with technology, doesn't that change with respect to time? So defining what class means is perhaps a objective, a non-class warfare means of rejecting strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny with respect to class. But again, U.S. versus Richardson escapes quite a bit of scrutiny when it is that case which renders class legally more or less invisible, right? And then further, less than, I guess it's more than 10 years from now, it seems like it was just the other day, we have the case of Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. The idea that wealth is property, the idea that corporations have free speech, right? And therefore can't be regulated with respect to elections. And therefore, when we talk about political capital, right? I mentioned human capital. I've mentioned social capital. We all know about financial capital, but we can also consider politics as capital, your vote as capital. But your vote, if you're not allowed, if you have spending limits, if you have campaign spending limits, the argument is that each individual's vote counts more. But if you don't have spending limits and you let the wealthy spend as much as they would like to influence the discussion and the discourse and to lobby and to make politicians beholden, then you've diminished the votes of individuals and enhanced the power of the wealthy over politics, right? And therefore have minimized what is so-called political capital or concentrated political capital in the hands of the wealthy. That is more or less the definition of plutocracy, right? Oligarchy kind of deals with finance. Plutocracy deals more with kind of who controls government, right? And I guess the distinction between oligarchy and plutocracy can also be numbers. Oligarchy kind of seems to include, could include vast numbers of wealthy people, where plutocracy seems to invoke or denote a small number of feudal families or controllers of the economy, and that comports with kind of a neoconservative vision of the world. The interesting thing about Citizens United, and one of the very frustrating things about Citizens United, I may have mentioned it before, is that the rationale to defend Citizens United plays upon Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott, a black man, and his wife, she's not mentioned often, but the suit also, she had a companion suit, and it was collapsed into his name, but she also was a subject of the suit. Um, the argument was, I'm trying to think, it was Illinois versus Kansas. If you stepped in a free state, right, from a slave state, you could be free, declared free. It was also very similar to England, right? England may have allowed slavery in its territories, but if you set foot on English ground, you became free because that ground could not in that way tolerate enslavement on it, right? Foreign, sure, but not on these grounds. So that became the issue in America, that could a free state, especially, right, the Western territories are now making themselves states, right? There used to be 13 colonies and 13 states, and then 14, 15, 16, 17. We don't talk about, again, Ohio, Illinois, and all those states coming into the Union and having to decide whether they were free states or slave states, right? And so those that declared themselves free states would often say that the black folks there were free if you reached that soil. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted to try to pull folks back to those slave states in southern states. But as Dred Scott sued for his freedom because he was in Illinois, or was an Illinois citizen, sued in federal court, the question was whether there was even jurisdiction, right? Or and again, goes back to standing. Was he one of the people of the United States? And the Supreme Court said, I think it's what, Justice Taney? Justice Taney wrote that that a state could not create a federal citizen, right? That a state declaring you a person did not have to be respected by the federal government. Now let's flip that with your Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. Now we're arguing that a state-created corporation, a corporation that's called a person by the state, now it is black folks that are arguing that the federal government should not recognize a state-created person. So now we're black folks, we're arguing that the state could create a person in Dred Scott. In Federal Election Commission, the trick of it is, how do you latch on to an argument that you were totally against in Dred Scott, right? The conservative majority said we went down that path once years before and it was a disaster. So to deny federal citizenship to a creature of the state would be unconstitutional, according to the conservative majority on the court in Citizens United. There was some talk of trying to have a constitutional convention or trying to repeal Citizens United. It was a very fervent uproar in the first 2 years, but it seems to have been pacified. I really didn't hear hardly any of it mentioned in this campaign cycle, and I really didn't hear it from even the more radical or progressive side pushing it as a campaign agenda. So perhaps it is just a done deal. Maybe it's a fait accompli. I would argue that the quintessential intersection of race and class, especially with respect to the law, is the poll taxes. and the irrepressibility, it seems, of poll taxes. We just can't, for some reason, get away from them. Now, poll taxes have kind of morphed in meaning. Poll taxes initially started not just as a cost or price to vote, they were a price of your citizenship. If you were a citizen of a state, instead of paying income taxes, instead of paying wealth taxes, instead of paying sales taxes, the very first tax that you were ever subject to, and most of the time the only tax you would have been subject to, perhaps in the 17th and early 18th century, is strictly the poll tax, right? Basically, dues for us to have this town, or us to have, and there would be a flat rate for the year. There would be distinctions based on, often on gender. There would be distinctions based on age, right? But paying the poll tax was not just for your right to vote, but was your pass to sort of citizenship. And it was very interesting because you can see lots of, when we talk about whether Black people were or were not citizens of the United States, the argument that they were was they paid taxes, especially in the North, and oftentimes even in the South. That there were free Black people, all Black people were not slaves, and that the free Black peoples that were in this country paid taxes. And if I pay taxes, if you require me to pay taxes, I must be a citizen. Because if you're putting me on the level of dogs or animals or whatever, you don't ask them to pay taxes, right? So you can see lots of petitions from Black people to the federal government and Black people to local and state governments asking for them for racial redress on the basis that they were taxpayers' citizens, right? Now, 17th, 18th, and 19th century poll taxes, like I said, they were usually a flat rate. So let's say $10 a year. And again, $10 wasn't a little bit back then. However, there were gradations. White women were never charged a poll tax, never. Children under a certain age or elderly men over a certain age, no poll tax. But white men, typically poll tax. Now, you could argue that on the one hand, white women not being taxed represented the desirability of white women especially if we think of this as a time of exploration. If we think of America at that time as a place of exploration, there aren't many women explorers coming from Europe, right? As far as sailors, as far as soldiers, as far as conquistadors, they are predominantly male. And then if we talk about moving from the north to the south, again, it's not a desirable place for white people. Even white slave owners in South Carolina tended to live. They may have owned property in South Carolina, but they tended to live in the north. They even lived in England sometimes, right? So the presence of white women was very desirable, and therefore no taxes on them. You could also flip that totally on the other side and say, no, the reason why they weren't taxed is because they were basically thought of as the property of white men, right? So you could look at it as desirability on the one hand, you could look at it as patriarchy on the other, right? Now, enslaved Blacks, there was always a tax. The tax on enslaved Blacks were higher than those on white men. But of course, it wasn't enslaved Blacks who had to pay it. It was the slave owners that had to pay the tax on the enslaved Blacks that they held. And in fact, there is a rich, rich history of so-called abolitionist taxes, where white people, and especially poor white people, lobbied for much higher poll taxes on slaves, so that would make slavery unprofitable, right? To try to make slavery so unprofitable that you get rid of it, that you couldn't afford to have a slave operation because of the taxes. This would be called abolitionist taxes. Now, there's an interest convergence there, because the reason why poor white people supported abolitionist taxes was most often because the importation of slaves was basically illegal immigration at that time, right? Black folks were stealing labor or competition. So if slaves were the blacksmith, poor white people couldn't be the blacksmith because slaves worked cheaper. If slaves were the doctor, the seamstress, and note that John Hope Franklin argues that by 1850, more than 50% of black people did not work in agriculture as slaves, that they worked in occupations, right? So if black people are working those occupations, but the slave master is getting paid, and understand that there was a huge emerging slave rental, slave leasing industry, right? So you would breed slaves just to rent them out as if they were cars. But that again is competition against poor white blue collar workers. And so there should have been an interest convergence between black folks and poor whites to raise taxes on elite white folks so that we could end slavery. And yet, uh, just as they do today, Robin Einhorn makes this point very clear in American Taxation and American Slavery. The same arguments used today were used back then to convince poor whites not to raise taxes on slave owners by saying it would ruin the economy, it would kill the country, it would do X, Y, and Z. So the interest convergence between poor blacks and poor whites have always been divided. There's always been a divide and conquer strategy between poor people along the term, along the class of race. And then we also see the payment of poor whites to maintain slavery through race patrols, right? Slave patrols, which eventually become, which are the predecessor to the modern police force. I won't bore you much more on Robin Einhorn's taxes. Then we morph. So in the 20th century, poll taxes take on a different character. So where 20th century, 17th and 19th century poll taxes were, oh, I'm sorry, real quick, free blacks got higher tax than all. So the state would tax higher, free blacks higher than white men or enslaved blacks. Then there will also be cities would also add on taxes, like the city of Charleston would add on to the state's tax for the presence of free blacks. And also there would be taxes on white businesses that dealt with free blacks. So boarding houses that housed free blacks would have to pay an extra $10 tax a year. And certain occupations that hired free blacks may have been subject to higher taxes. Anyway, 20th century taxes were converted from keeping the white poor from voting to keeping black people from voting. So 20th century poll taxes come along and poor whites are grandfathered in, so-called grandfather clauses. And sometimes we use that term today in contract law. Well, if we start a new contract today that's restrictive, does it affect the people that were already involved? No, they've been grandfathered in. If you've heard that term, that comes from grandfather clauses in poll taxes that said, yes, these you have to pay to vote, you have to take literacy tests to vote, you have to do all these things to vote. But if your grandfather could vote, then so can you without taking these tests as a means of excluding blacks. And it's very interesting. You see right there how pretext is used instead of blatant race monikers. So instead of just saying black people can't vote, you're grandfathered in a race neutral rule that is clearly designed to exclude black people. So that is kind of the birth of this. So after Brown versus Board of Education, when you can't use outward a race expressively, using pretext that they use in poll taxes becomes thing. Now, 21st century, again, there are now new poll taxes, and they seem to be designed to keep black people from voting for the Democratic Party, and yet they also sweep in, because of their breadth, they sweep in the poor white people that are also in those neighborhoods, right? So Marion versus Crawford is the Seventh Circuit case. I think it's like around 2008 or 2009, where Judge Posner, who we've talked about in this course, was the chief judge and wrote the opinion in Marion versus Crawford that said incidental burdens on the voting practice do not amount to a poll tax, right? So no matter if we close polling stations, if we require you to drive across state, all these things that make voting more expensive still will not be considered poll tax unless we directly extract a specific cost from you. So $10 for a voter ID, that's a poll tax, right? So that was scuttled, but making you get a voter ID and then only having one place in the state that issues voter IDs and putting that in a white neighborhood and making all the other black neighbors, people come to that place, no matter the cost, it will not be considered a poll tax. After Marion versus Crawford, yeah, Shelby versus Holder, which basically eviscerated parts of the Voting Rights Act. And so now you have a case in 2021, Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, where the state of Arizona passed a whole bunch of more laws that seem to suppress the vote and impose higher costs on black people than others. And so not only is the Voting Rights Act going to be considered, I would hope that there would be some discussion of poll tax, but I'm not that hopeful. Poverty law as interest convergence. Again, this idea that poor blacks and poor whites have more in common than they have against each other. The argument that there should be an interest convergence, some say, in arguing that the Constitution should be injected with positive rights. Has anybody heard the term negative rights versus positive rights when it comes to the Constitution? Negative rights describes the fact that the Constitution mostly and especially the Bill of Rights, right? The first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, 10th Amendment, all those, what do? They tell you what the government cannot do. The government cannot pass laws against free speech. It can't deprive you of your life, liberty, or property without due process of law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Always telling the government what it can't do. The Supreme Court negates, right? It sets aside rules. It scuttles legislation. It is negative. On the other hand, one of the only positive rights in the Constitution is that the Constitution specifically requires Congress to create copyright law and patent law. It says it specifically that Congress must create patents and copyrights for authors and inventors. Other than that, the Constitution does not say you have to alleviate poverty. The Constitution does not say you have to provide education. The Constitution does not say you have to provide health. It could, but it doesn't, right? We can go to the United Nations and find charters that say that all countries must provide health or against racism or whatever the case may be. But those rules of the United Nations do not trump the Constitution within these borders, right? And so we're going to talk about later in the semester, I want to say there's maybe 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to start talking about positive rights, education, welfare, health, and big tent critical race theory with respect to those. But when it comes to critical race theory, I argue that, I don't think this is in Kiara Bridges' book, but I argue that critical race theory misses interest convergence with respect to labor law, antitrust law, contract law. There are very few critical race theory scholars who work in these areas. In labor law, on the one hand, labor law unions have been, I don't want to say dismantled, but they've been discounted, they've been marginalized, and labor unions have been the place where many black people have attained middle-class status, going all the way back to the railroad porters of the 1920s and the 1930s. On the other hand, labor unions also excluded Black people. And one of the biggest issues of the 21st century now is defunding the police with respect with the against the resistance, of the police unions, right? So critical race theory and its engagement with labor law, positive or negative, seems to be somewhat lacking. There's just not a lot of scholarship there. Um, there's probably even less scholarship dealing with critical race theory and antitrust law. Antitrust law is designed to break up monopolies. It's designed to break up wealth concentration. It is designed to support small businesses. And if Black people are on the bottom under the racial wealth gap and need to start small businesses and be able to compete against the big ones, then Black people and Black scholars probably should pay a lot more attention to antitrust. But again, not just critical race theory, but also critical legal studies seems to have, I don't want to say abandoned, but not expended much energy towards influencing antitrust law and the concentration of wealth and corporate monopolies seems to reflect that. Also, contract law. There's a few critical race scholars that have written papers years ago, but it seems to have died out. We don't see a lot of critical race theory dealing with contract law, except kind of in the reproductive health genre, right? Again, I'm not very well versed in it, but surrogacy and those types of contracts, or even contracts with respect to in vitro fertilization, where you get to choose race, where you get to choose eye color, or what if there's a mistake and you're given a baby of the wrong race. So there has been scholarship with respect to contract law, but it does not seem to have dealt with Black and poor or poverty generally. There are a cadre of Black tax scholars that push hard for progressive taxation, but also describe how Black folks are specifically subordinated within the tax code. Some of my mentors include Beverly Moran at Vanderbilt, Alice Gresham Bullock at Howard, the Queen Dorothy Brown at Emory. She's the chancellor at Emory University at this point. Karen Brown at George Washington. But again, even the progressive taxation not only has been attacked and reduced by tax cuts for the wealthy over the last 35 years, reduction of the estate tax over the last 35 years, it's also hallmarked by the increase in sales and sin taxes in localities and cities across the country. So because sales and sin taxes fall most heavily upon the poor, right? Rich people can often avoid them, on top of the fact that they're a much smaller percentage of rich people's income. So again, taxation is a area of law where there would seem to be a natural coalition between poor Black and poor white people as far as this intersection of race and class. Policing for profit, civil asset forfeiture. It's very interesting. Civil asset forfeiture, the idea that the police who stop you can, if you think you have committed some type of crime, can take your property, take your car, take your jewelry, take your money if they allege that that property is relating in any way to the crime, and that you have to then get it back. And because it is a civil matter, because they're only taking your property and not your liberty, they only have to win by the preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Even the Conservative Heritage Foundation has come out strongly against civil asset forfeiture, because once you start messing with property, that you've brought in wealthy people's interest convergence as well. So from Black to poor white to wealthy white, civil asset forfeiture has been attacked on all sides. But policing for profit otherwise, the over policing of black neighborhoods such as Ferguson, Missouri, PG County, um, Maryland is one of the counties in the country who derive over 15 to 20% of their budget from police fines and fees and forfeitures, and that they are disproportionately levied on black folks. And not only that, again, that the statistical likelihood that police will profit correlates to how many black people are in your jurisdiction. Now, I say that about progressive taxation because we have for some reason has never been a serious consideration between uh, expanding progressive taxation to progressive regulation. What do I mean by that? Well, very specifically, should small businesses, and I mean small businesses, not the government calls small businesses something other than like 500 people. I mean, we can have levels, large corporations, international corporations, conglomerates, mid-sized businesses, small businesses, mom and pop businesses, startup businesses. Should they all be regulated the same? Should they be imposed the same cost, regardless how big they are? Should Rodriguez should Rodriguez grocery store on Fifth and Cambria be subject to the same regulation as Microsoft, Tesla, and Amazon? Should and very specifically, let's talk about the minimum wage. Unfortunately, and I guess we should have brought that up too, that it did not pass the House. It didn't even wait to get scuttled in the Senate. The 15-hour minimum wage did not even pass the House. So very interesting to me. And so $15 an hour, let's say it would have passed. Would that have burdened, would that have benefited class generally, but yet burdened small businesses, a disproportionate number of which would be small black businesses? Ms. Carroll, for sure.
If we have to wait for interests to converge for there to be change, when would that happen in relation to minimum wage? Like, at what point would the person that, like, I think someone was holding a Lululemon bag
Mm-hmm.
while they voted no on the bill.
Yeah.
Like, when would that rich white person's interests converge enough with the people that work at the jobs that need more than $15?
Yeah.
When would that ever happen, realistically?
So that's the thing about racial realism. That's why racial realism goes into Afro pessimism, because Derek Bell, just like his fifth rule of racial standing, just because we understand interest convergence doesn't mean that interest will always converge. So the answer could be never, right? The answer could be never. So now let's put never to the side because it has been raised over time, right? When I was a child, it was like $3. When I was a teenager, it was $3.35 an hour, right? And when I worked at Veteran Stadium for $5, it was like, whoa, this is a great job, right? But again, think about the prices back then too, right? A cheeseburger from McDonald's was like 29 cents, right? A Big Mac or a candy bar was 25, 30 cents. A soda was 60 cents or 50 cents. So it's very interesting question. How do I say this? Well, I'm just going to say it. Wealth needs social stability. When there is no longer social stability, oh, interest convergence in the Black Lives Matter protests. At what point did all these corporate forces come up with Juneteenth Day? When did they start coming up with all of these overtures and to black businesses and whatnot? After riots, right? The Civil Rights Act was passed after the Watts riots. So we don't like to talk about it. We one of the reasons why if we talk about the rules of racial standing, one of the reasons why Martin Luther King, and forgive me for this blasphemy for anyone who feels it is, one of the reasons why Martin Luther King has so far outpaced Malcolm X since the 60s and the 70s, when at that time you could make the argument that more black people supported Malcolm X than Martin Luther King at that time. Martin Luther King was one of the most hated men in America from both black and white people. And so his elevation to almost godlike status relates to the utility of nonviolence to rich white people, right? That to commit to require everyone who is an activist or whatnot to commit to nonviolence, right? Suggests that, okay, yeah, no rioting, no, right? So I know that's a controversial statement, but if we want to be honest and real, racial realism about when change often happens in this country, that is one of the times when wealthy people see uh, um, it in their interest to help poor people. Um, let's even go back to the French Revolution, right? When the guillotine starts dropping, that's when they start giving out bread. Now, am I advocating that? No. But how else might we get this? So, how else might we get there a convergence? I'll give you this. It apparently has not been enough to get the $15 minimum wage passed, but there is an interest convergence that with respect to not just poor people but black people. Um, let's see if I can frame it quickly. The United States is like a ship, right? Think of the United States as like an old school 17th, 18th century ship where there's a galley and people rowing the boat, and there's the captains and the people on top and the steer, and you got sails and all of that stuff. And now think of every other country also as a similar type of clipper ship or something like that, right? Well, at this point in time, it seems that China's ship is sailing faster than ours, right? And therefore, the more efficient and inclusive treatment of the people on your boat you might have, if you are discriminating against black people, you might be relegating your very best sea captain to rowing the boat. You might be relegating your best Latina navigator to some menial task under in the galleys as a cook, right? And so discrimination causes an efficiency of talent on that boat, right? I could make the argument that this current overture to racial inclusion is to get the boat to row faster. And that's why we see some overtures towards greater racial inclusion, and that perhaps one could push that narrative even further, that again the discrimination or penalizing the white poor with what do you call it, low minimum wage or inadequate minimum wage is causing the boat to row slower, right? That interest convergence of this boat rowing faster than China's boat is very similar to this boat rowing faster than Russia's boat, which Derek Bell argues is the reason why we have Brown versus Board of Education, right? To convince the whole rest of the world that America is the land of opportunity. Similar to that, and even we're going to discuss that later, Douglas Blackman's Slavery by Another Name argues that real slavery, just because you outlaw slavery in 1865 doesn't mean it ended. That the federal government did not actually prosecute slavers until the 1940s. And again, only because we were starting a Cold War against the East and the Germans and the Soviets, and we had to present ourselves as the land of opportunity. So those are the interest convergences that Derek Bell talks about, and we kind of see that today in our competition with China. So if we're going to try to push or propose or promote the idea that minimum wage should be increased between racial and class lines, That is, in my view, the argument that we're going to have to use for elite whites to see it in their interest. And frankly, I can make that argument, but I don't even necessarily know or think that it's going to be that effective, at least right now in the short run. Great question. I wish I could have. I wish I had a better answer. Let's see. Yeah, yeah, that is. And you think about it. I use shame, right? And shame doesn't always work, but some people think it does. So um, I start with the idea that again, the 13th Amendment is the first minimum wage law, right? It's interesting to me that that's not a point that's often made. The first law that we have in America that says that workers have to get some payment is the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. So once you have the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the natural question becomes what number, what wage distinguishes paid work versus slavery, right? If I can't enslave you, can I pay you 1 penny an hour, 1 penny a day, 1 penny a year, and then say that you're not a slave? There has to be at some number, $100 a year, $3 an hour. There has to be some minimum wage that proves that you are not a slave. And so I would argue that we don't use that discourse to argue that $7 an hour forces people to work harder than people did during slavery. The idea that working 2 jobs 6-7 days a week is more taxing to and still not being able to pay the bills is more taxing to someone today than certain slaves on, let's say, not cotton, not rice, tobacco farms, right? If you study slavery, all slave plantations are not the same as far as onerousness of work. Rice plantations, you're going to die at some point early in life. Cotton plantations, very hard, but maybe not as bad as rice. Tobacco, not as difficult and not as hot and intemperate as cotton and whatnot. So could we use the discourse that some people today working 2, 3 jobs, etc., actually are being paid less than slave? You may even, white folks in the 19th century often decried wage slavery, right? Wage slavery, especially out in the West. White folks were often tricked to leave the East, go to let's say, silver mining camp in Nevada. There's been a silver discovery in Nevada, and we need workers. And so you're tantalized and promoted of high wages to come out to this town in somewhere near Reno, Nevada, to mine silver. But when you get there, yes, you get paid, but who owns the store? The company. Who owns the water, the food, the clothes? The company. And so the prices of all the goods are set to exceed what you're paid. And therefore the worker is always in debt. Sharecropping as well, to set so that the worker is always in debt. And poor white people called that wage slavery. And for some reason, that discourse has disappeared. And not even disappeared in the last decade or so, disappeared practically in my lifetime. I know of the term from reading history, but not from political discourse in my entire life. I was going to make another point about wage slavery, but I forgot. Anyway, okay. But again, great questions. So the intersection of race and class, again, how can we address this in the law? Aside from minimum wage, we as lawyers right, are caught in the middle of this conundrum because we have affection perhaps for our race. We might have affection for the poor. We have affection for our gender. We want to do social, we want to be social activists, or as Howard Law says, social engineers instead of parasites on society. And yet, I got all these student loans I got to pay back. I got to work and make some money to pay off these student loans. And that provides so few lawyers that can quote unquote afford to do family court, veterans court, bankruptcy court, immigration court, public benefits hearings, right? The amount of pro se litigants, that is, and of course that means litigants that can't afford lawyers, the amount of pro se litigants in these so-called poverty law courts is astounding. Astounding, right? And not only that, the courts hate it. The judges in those courts, they feel it is so very inefficient because each litigant that is pro se has to be retaught the procedure over and over and over again. Instead of dealing with a stream of lawyers that know the process, that know the procedure, the judges have to deal with individuals that have no concept of process and procedure and have to be taught each case, which causes the court cases to slow down and make things that much worse, right? So there are judges who actually are supporting the idea of having people be able to represent the indigent in these cases with only so-called quasi-law degrees, right? If you've heard of, there are a lot of schools around the country that are coming up with things called a Masters of Jurisprudence and certain programs that are law related, but something less than 3-year law degrees. And they haven't yet, but they may lead to the opportunity for these folks to represent, because they've spent little less for their degrees, that they may be more able to feed themselves and make money off of representing people in these so-called poverty law courts. Or what else could we do? We could fund those. We could pay, the state could pay those lawyers, right? We pay for public defenders. But here's the thing with public defenders. How much do they get paid? How much, and not only how much do they get paid, how much are they given to actually fight the case, to find the evidence, to hire expert witnesses? Just because you have a right to a lawyer in a capital case for murder, how much money is the state going to give that lawyer to fund your defense, to make the copies, to fly around the country and interview witnesses, to bring them back, to have laboratories do DNA testing, etc. Right? So the amount that states, we don't talk about due process and money. We talk about the right to a lawyer as due process and then leave it by itself. But is there a due process right to a certain amount of funding for your case? I say that to say, should there also be legislation or public defenders or public representatives that handle cases in family court, in veterans court, in bankruptcy court? Should you have the right to a lawyer or some type of representation paid by the state if you are entering into one of those arenas or those hearings? And the confluence of race and class suggests that this would be beneficial for poor people generally and disproportionately for Black people, right? Or people of color. There's a very interesting case in 1982 called the Superior Court Trial Lawyers Association. My very first law review article or comment, whatever you want to call it, was on consumer boycotts versus civil litigation. I wanted to explore the concept of, and this goes back to you, Ms. Carroll, about interest convergence. What do you do when if interest convergence is when the law intervenes? Well, what about interest divergence? And my argument in those cases was to boycott, right? And does boycotting have a First Amendment protection? Is there a First Amendment right to boycott? The Supreme Court in NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware says yes, there is a First Amendment right to boycott. However, if you boycott for your own personal benefit, it can be considered an antitrust violation, a restraint, an illegal restraint of trade. So that means if you boycott a business, you probably don't want to take funding, or because every boycott, what do you need? You need you still need the phones to come on. You still need lights. You need bill, right? All protests still has to be supported financially, right? Websites and all that other thing. If so, where are you going to get the money from? So if your boycott is funded independently, you're protected by First Amendment. But if your boycott is against Target, is funded by Walmart, you're putting your boycott in jeopardy of an antitrust suit. And so again, that's where lawyers can advise social action groups, right? I happen to work for the NAACP National Voter Fund. I used to be the chief operating officer there, and when I was hired by the chief operating officer, operating officer, he said, "You have no qualifications to be the COO, but for your legal knowledge, because we're going to have to go through a bunch of minefields." Superior Court Trial Lawyers Association is an example of that. The public defenders in DC Superior Court, and I believe Professor Angela Davis, she is very much aware of this case and knows some of the participants in them. They felt they were not getting, they got paid to represent the poor, but it was such a paltry amount. You only got the worst lawyers to do it. And so they organized a boycott that nobody would take the cases until the city of DC raised the pay for public defenders. And the Supreme Court found that that was an antitrust violation, because their primary purpose was to raise their own pay, even if that was in service of creating better representation for the poor. Beyond poverty law courts, again, courts are not the only places where we do lawyering. Lawyering in administrative law hearings is growing and growing and growing. And so again, where does the road go? Zoning issues, all of these decisions that are made regarding how government actually operates often allow public participation, right? And so those that are interested in intersection of law and race and poverty, I believe critical race theory also has a very big blind spot with respect to administrative law and how to attack or approach the arbitrary and capricious standard. We've mentioned impact statements in the last class, and that is one of the current proposals to address race and class within government bureaucracy. Again, Deborah Archer was a leading scholar in that before she was just hired by the ACLU. I personally have a concept called racially asymmetric market imperfections. It emanates from the already established duty of the government to eliminate free market imperfections. I argue that to the extent that is a cogent, acceptable, legitimate legal argument accepted by both liberals and conservatives, that we should go further with respect to critical race theory and also eliminate those market imperfections that are asymmetrical with respect to race. Okay, let's look at intersection of race and class. What time is it? Okay, it's a little more time. The intersection of race and class from a little bit of different perspective. What about intra-Black interest divergence, right? Critical race theory, as mentioned by Athena Matua, has blind spots, right? that oftentimes is civil rights law um, middle or upper class normative, right? Does the fact that upper class, middle class, upper middle class lawyer blacks that have come from bourgeoisie families, does that control over what the civil rights message is? Does that marginalize black poor people? There was a book published in the 1950s by E. Franklin Frazier called The Black Bourgeoisie. And it was very critical of W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP and other black folks that E. Franklin Frazier, who was, again, a Howard Law professor, dean of the Black Studies Department and what have you, arguing that their push for greater inclusion was at the expense of poor blacks who needed better material conditions, right? Include that the push for inclusion tends to benefit already middle class and wealthy blacks, to get already middle and wealthy blacks into elite colleges, power six brokerage firms, the top executive suites, when at the same time the bottom layer is just as degraded and subject to poverty as ever before. So we see that again, Derek Bell on Brown versus Board of Education. At the very beginning of the book, Kiara Bridges calls Derek Bell's approach conservative because he argues, again, as one of the lead litigators and figures in desegregation cases, that the pleas from black parents were for better schools. However, by any means necessary, just give us better schools. But the elite black folks insisted that that integration was the highest principle, right? Symbolism and inclusion versus material benefit, justice and equality versus liberty and inclusion. And we see this somewhat play out in the 2020 elections, right? Within intra-black politics, on the one hand, you would see that those who tended to favor Biden and the Democratic Party push for the elimination of student loans. And of course, you have to have already gone to college and expended money towards a higher education to be eligible for that student loan reduction, versus those black folks that were not for Trump, but just arguing to not vote at all, to hold the vote, to boycott the vote. Their argument was, well, neither side is going to give us reparations, which is the only issue that quote unquote matters, right? So this division of interest, even within black people, right? Because again, the argument, or not the argument, the truth of the matter is, again, black people are not necessarily a monolith and do not all have the same interest at heart. So I asked the question, and we're not going to get to hardly anything today, because I'm going to beat you guys in the head about hip hop and the law, right? Again, does hip hop, the CRT have a blind spot to hip hop music and culture as a representation of marginalized people of color? Does hip hop represent Afro pessimism? Does hip hop represent Afro surrealism? Right. So again, there is a cadre of law scholars that call themselves hip hop and the law. There's no discussion of it within the book Critical Race Theory. Is that identification of a blind spot, right? That critical race theory is captured by the upper income stratas of black people. Hip hop itself, right? All of the documentaries about hip hop always emphasize how it was born in the 1970s in the Bronx, where poverty seemed to be most obvious at any point in this country's history, and that it was a counter narrative to the supposed success of the civil rights movement, the supposed responding to the dismantling of all the Black Power institutions by the FBI and COINTELPRO, and the rejection of kind of the syrupy Motown R&B sound, um, and in favor of more strident um, entertainment or music, such as "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised" by Gil Scott Heron, or "Niggas Are Scared of Revolution" by the Last Poets, other things like that. So I'm not going to, so hip hop and the law is a thing. You can read there's a book with a compilation of articles, key writings that form the movement, by Bridgewater, Tibbs, and Cummings. I happen to have a couple articles in it. Books that have been written on hip hop and the law. There's Paul Butler's A Hip Hop Theory of Punishment, which is really interesting. Andrea Dennis, who was at University of Georgia. She has a real hot book that came out, I keep saying last year, I guess it's 2 years now. Rap on Trial, Race, Law, and Guilt in America. It's about social media and how rap lyrics that are published on social media and in records and all that are used as evidence. And we can even include white privilege in here when the same verve for using that type of artistic expression is not used against horror writers and country writers and other white writers of gory materials and what have you. That when it comes to hip hop, those lyrics represent the truth when it comes to, but white people have the privilege of saying violent lyrics as just something to get off my chest. There's so many people I know that have explained their love of NWA because it helped them express their rage or express their opposition and whatnot. Not because I actually want to go out and shoot and kill like they say they shoot and kill. And then also let's talk about gangster rappers like Ice Cube, who were suburban born, oftentimes college educated folks that put on a role. I mean, he's shown over the last 30 years, he is one of the greatest actors of our time, right? From gangster to TV dad to now political activist. I mean, he is such a great actor. Most people do not know his name is O'Shea Jackson, right? That people call him Ice Cube in real life as if that's his name. It's funny to me. Anyway, is hip hop progressive? I am one of the few, I have to concede that of my colleagues that call themselves hip hop and the law scholars, I am probably one of the few that does not self-describe himself as progressive. That the majority of them do and also present hip hop as being progressive. And so I don't think it is. I am one that believes hip hop is what I call Afro surreal. And the reason, I can't go into too much of it, but I can describe, argue why I don't think hip hop fits within the current rubric and why it then extends to something like Afro surrealism. So is hip hop conservative? Is it conservative? There are certainly plenty of hip hop artists that focus strictly on what? Little Kim, money, power, and respect. It's the key to life, right? Money, power, respect. Have you eaten right, right? So there's lots of that. There's lots of that in hip hop. So does that make hip hop conservative because there's so much of a concern about property that my self-expression is all about liberty, right? Right. I need the freest liberty, say whatever I want to say, right? But at the same time, sex and violence doesn't seem to be conservative from a social or moral standpoint, right? It does not seem to be a way to maintain or conserve a community, right? So in that respect, it just doesn't seem to fit inside or perfectly outside of conservatism. Progressiveness. Killer Mike is a progressive activist. The Fugees, Lauryn Hill, even going all the way back to the late 90s, there are lots of politically, Talib Kweli, who I mentioned last week, there's lots of politically minded hip hop artists. At the same time, are they not drowned out by those that promote flossing, right? As a matter of fact, the term player hating, the term player hating is a criticism of conscious rappers, right? That conscious rappers are the original so-called player haters. And the idea that this term hater has become ubiquitous is also just amazing as someone who's watched hip hop more or less kind of take over the world. Stop snitching campaign that was popular in hip hop maybe 5 to 10 years. That just doesn't seem to be consistent with progressive ideology, right? So it's again, it doesn't seem to fit neatly in, doesn't seem to fit neatly outside of, or even neoliberalism. There's a strong case to say hip hop is neoliberal, right? The rapper Noriega and his song Super Thug. You don't like the law, break it. I don't care. But when you get caught, remember, I don't care, right? And again, this idea of extreme individualism. You're free to do what you want to do, but I'm free not to care about what you do, right? So you are a person, you have a life, need to be respected as an individual by the law. But me as an individual, I'm on my own thing. So I don't. But at the same time, it doesn't. Hip hop is also Tupac, right? They got money for wars, but can't feed the poor. So that seems to be very progressive, right? So hip hop doesn't seem to fit neatly within these branches. We can talk about everything, even though what we do is wrong with Jay-Z being Siegel and all that. We can talk about hip hop as a rejection of white privilege, right? We just talked about white privilege. And hip hop seems to reject white privilege by taking things that are stereotypical and then turning around and making it praiseworthy, right? Embracing otherness instead of being subordinated by the fact that I am called this name or stereotype, to embrace it, to be real niggas, real bitches, real all that stuff, right? To embrace the otherness and make it actually a positive within your own construct. Not just to reject societal norms, but to subvert them and actually spin them around 180, right? Hip hop can also be seen as perhaps a rejection of white supremacy. The idea that black folks, and not just black folks, black, Latino, even white folks, I'm a big Beastie Boys fan and all that. So that these poor kids in New York created a world that is more meritocratic than the one that the United States promotes, right? That breakdancing is about to be in the Olympics, right? That if you are the best rhymer, if you're the best DJ, if you're the best breakdancer, if you're the best graffiti artist, you get props within hip hop, regardless of your race, right? Regardless of your religion. Sexual orientation may be a little more problematic. Gender may be a little more problematic, right? But at the same time, hip hop and Afro pessimism. I can say all of that, but then don't I have to deal with the fact that the rap music industry controls? And this again, this relates to the law when we talk about elite whites or interest convergence of elite whites, and we equate elite whites with so-called shareholders. And the same thing with hip hop. Okay, hip hop can want to be surreal, it can want to be counterculture, but flossing and all that, that doesn't seem counterculture. That seems to be very consumerish, like all of the rest of America, right? So has gangster rap, flossing and all that been co-opted by the rap music industry and therefore not represent Afro-surrealism, just represents a perpetuation of negative stereotypes, etc. And in response to that, it's really interesting, the hip hop essentialism, right? The idea that hip hop has a definition, right? There used to be this idea that hip hop was 4 factors: MCing, DJing, breakdancing, graffiti. That was the foundation. If you were doing that, you were doing hip hop. But the next thing you know, not everybody's breakdancing anymore. Next thing you know, not everybody's graffiti anymore. Next thing you know, there's really not any cutting and scratching anymore. So hip hop has kind of been reduced to just the MC and the beat maker at this point. And has that then allowed that straying from its foundations, that rejection of conservatism lead to its degradation, right? So really interesting about hip hop as a way to analyze conservatism outside of US politics and its taintedness by race. Okay, so we've killed all the time before we could even get to any of the readings for this week with respect to race, sexuality, disability, and religion. So I will ask that we keep up with the readings, even though the readings for next week clearly won't be discussed next week, because the readings for this week will have to take center stage for next week. So I appreciate you guys sticking by me, and I appreciate you guys hanging out. What's it, 4 minutes past time? Somewhere along the line, I'm gonna figure out a way to give you those 4 minutes back, and probably a couple minutes from other classes and all that. But thank you for hanging out, and I'll see you guys next Wednesday.
Thanks, Professor.
Have a good night.
All right, have a good night.